Hello, I'd just like to echo Frank's welcome. I'm Alice, Higher Education Manager at Opera North. Opera North, obviously with the University of Leeds, have our DARE partnership that curate and look after the creative labs. Last year, DARE turned 10, and I think it's quite exciting that, as Frank said, we've had other editions of the labs before, that we keep looking to develop and adapt the labs to questions that are coming up, because obviously the world has changed a lot in the last 10 years. And it's very exciting that we're having a biological sciences specific edition. So I'd like to just take some time to introduce our groups. We were very pleased to receive a lot of amazing applications this year. So we've got 5 pairs, or groups, should we say. And we've got Jack Goode and Jono Gadsby from Fused Imagination. We've got Paul Knox with novelist Claire Fisher. Illustrator Amy Evans with Fasil Mushtaq. Nathan Gearing and Rationale Theatre with Jocelyn Benitez Alfonso. And finally, we're going to hear from artist and sculptor Alison Smith with Christopher Hassel. So first, can I ask, are we going to just go straight into it? We're going to have Jack Goode and Jono Gadsby.
Hi everyone. It's quite strange to suddenly hear my voice amplified. I wasn't quite expecting that, so I'm a little nervous. You'll have to excuse me. So when we first started this, feels like 2 minutes ago, I said to Jack, send me everything. I want to go down the rabbit hole as deep as it goes. And he says, oh, brilliant, I'll send you some files. And the files I get were electrochemical sensing, enzyme inhibition, converting nanoparticles, split enzymes, and a lot of other stuff just surrounding this topic. And instantly I went, ooh, this is a very deep poll and it's very, very scientific. It then took about 2 weeks with a lot of Google defining stuff. I tore around the labs, meeting 6 of the people who are working on the team, interviews with each, a Q&A, a presentation, and eventually I started to understand what this project was about. And even then, I think I only understood about 40 to 50-ish% of just what they were trying to do, nothing to do with the science of how they were actually trying to go about it. But as we continued to talk, I started to try and think about it creatively. And the best way I can summarize it is the nearest diagnostic tool, they're creating a diagnostic tool for working out whether antibiotics would work if prescribed by a doctor. And the nearest tool at the moment seems to be, if you imagine trying to record if a plane has hit a runway, and you kind of, oh yeah, I heard that seems to have landed. And then as I was talking to these guys, they were looking to record the same event, but it was the same size runway, but it wasn't a plane landing. It wasn't a toy plane landing. It wasn't the wheel on the toy plane landing, it was the nut that was attached to the toy plane that went in. So it's not just about science, it's about creating an entire new methodology of how you can possibly measure such a small event. And for me, that's made me think about my own practice, the way that it brought out my own assumptions. For me, science was about what you could measure, what you could do. And these guys were taking something that was, for me, almost sci-fi. It was something that just isn't unattainable. And that's what I try and do in my arts practice. I try and take something that's a big question. Can we create something that makes us create a small change? Can we do something that leaves the world a little bit better? Can we take a problem and solve it? And so it's what I was suddenly given access to was a process of project creation, how an entire different world goes about tackling a massive project. And as I started to understand how they've gone about it, it made me realise how singular our approach had been. How it was that we could use different collaborations, different ways, that the problem itself is what we should be focusing on. And that by using different collaborants, we could work towards creating that goal in different ways. I went to the Arts Council and says, this is a revelation, this is fantastic. And they went, no, it's not, it's rubbish, this is PhD stuff. And I went, oh God, it's turned me into a PhD student. And I kind of, oh no, it really has. That's a good thing, actually. I really like the idea of kind of, if I look at the work I'm doing, we've been looking at legacy, we've been looking at kind of, and I've started to think about this in such detail that I've turned myself into a PhD student. The other day, I get an email from Leeds, and sure enough, the college has just put out a PhD looking at the artistry that I do. So I take over event spaces in a temporary space in society. We've just taken one over in Goldthorpe, which is next co-op, and it's in the most deprived area you can get, with the idea that if I create work in that space for a regular amount of time, can we start to see a larger output? Can we start to measure that output? Can we actually start to define what the outputs are of a theatre? But not just in a creative kind of... I've known for years that theatre is important for civic life, that it's part of a balanced civic life. But I've never thought how we can measure it, how you can actually define those outcomes. And this project is what that's allowed me to do. However, I didn't want to come back to the creative team and say, what it's really done is taught me how to be a PhD student. I wanted to give Jack a sense of the artistry that I've done. So we started to think about how we could tackle and do something collaborative. And we realised that unless we dragged an audience through the entire university, meeting all the people I had, having the interviews, having the Google research for 2 weeks, it was going to be very difficult for them to understand what they were doing. So we looked at how we could create one problem, how we could solve something. And within my creative team, dementia came up, the idea of kind of, could we use the process of our artistry to challenge something, to create an understanding. And we kind of thought it'd be really good to choose an audience that come into contact with dementia. And as we talked about, we don't want anything narrative-based. Because if we create something narrative-based, we're creating a subject that they see and hear and witness every day. What we want is something that makes them experience it, something that actually makes them understand what it is like to be in that bed for hours and hours and hours, suffering from dementia. And unfortunately, Jack became our guinea pig. We decided to go back to the happenings and interventions, which is the core and the research of our own artistry. And what that does is it kind of turns the gaze away from the aesthetics. It stops it being around what you can see and makes it about what the person's experiencing, how it is that you can alter that person's in some way, how you could actually make them experience things, and how we could begin to make that experience be something around dementia. So we took over the Bradford Playhouse. They very kindly gave us that space for 2 days. And we started to think about the modality and how we can create performance within modality. So I'm about to kind of, thankfully they recorded this experience of going around the Bradford Playhouse, which I've narrowed down to about 4 minutes. And it's what I'd really like you to concentrate on is not the abstract and the modality that they're witnessing, but what they're actually experiencing, what they're actually talking about, how their relationship changes, how hopefully we've managed to just make them begin to think about themselves within those surroundings and how themselves have become the protagonist. So Jack came down and experienced this and kind of saw it. And what came out was a lot of different things. We kind of had little elements that didn't work, elements that very much did work. And since then, we've started to talk about kind of how we can encapsulate and develop those areas that did work. Yeah, so in terms of my own outcomes, it's been really interesting to realise that it's actually completely changed the way I think about theatre, my own artistry, but also what I want to do and develop over the next 3 years. I very much do want to look at a PhD. Ooh. I'd say I'd watch it, but the auditory is much more. The audio is much more important than the actual visuals. Otherwise, it's just a guy pouring milk. It's pretty much useless. Shall we allow you to talk, Jack, and then we can watch this at the end? Should we find volume?
Yeah, that works. So what I was going to say sort of cues quite heavily from the video. So apologies if some of the context gets a bit lost on what I'm about to say. But in the walkthrough and the kind of experiential theatre that Nicola and myself did on the day, there were some really strong themes that emerged going around the theatre. And some of them personally felt like they had quite strong parallels in what we do as researchers. As Jono just referenced, me pouring milk, there were a lot of rooms and spaces set up where there were insinuations that there was a task to be done, but there were no direct instructions. And, you know, retrospectively, after discussing this, this was about putting you in that state of confusion where you don't know what you're meant to be doing, much like a dementia sufferer might have. And that really kind of spoke to me in a scientific sense, because we were doing things and being like, is this what we're meant to be doing? Are we getting completely distracted by some detail that's not relevant to the... Is this still? Yep. That's not relevant to the overall aims of what we're trying to achieve. And, you know, during my PhD, I probably spent weeks doing that, where I'd research a problem and then find out that the data I'd generated was completely irrelevant to the question I was asking, and I'd just wasted a month. So that was something I picked up on. And another thing in terms of putting yourself in the mindset of someone with dementia, which, again, is something we do in science all the time, is being self-critical. And really trying to work out if what we're seeing is real, if it's an effect, and how we can look into that. It works really well, and it's the basis of how we go about our research. But once we were going around the theatre, instructions started appearing, activities started changing around us, and then we started questioning ourselves. And that questioning ourselves, we see it as really important as scientists. But when you apply it to everyday things like instructions stuck to the back of a door, starts to get quite unnerving quite quickly. And having spoken to Jono, that was a lot of what he was trying to do. So it was really interesting as an experience to go through. One of the things that came from our discussions, from the approach that Jono has of trying to put you in that mindset, that has informed some of the outreach I'm doing. So at the minute, I'm designing outreach for schools, is rather than trying to didactically teach to people like this is what we do, engineering a situation so they feel that they're making the choices and they are experiencing the what it's like to be a scientist. So rather than having a worksheet, you know, asking their opinion and getting that information from them rather than teaching it to them. So that's kind of a really positive outcome in terms of what I'll go on to do with my outreach. Another thing in terms of the developmental process for the production that struck me is the similarities to science. So probably about 50-50 split between creative people and scientists in here. I'll start as scientists because that's where I'm more comfortable. But when we go to do a research topic, we do a lit review. So that's kind of looking at what research is already out there and what is known. And then once we've got that information, it's what can we bring that's new to it. And then once we've gone out and gathered our data and got our argument, we talk about how we communicate it. And the majority of the time, pretty much exclusively, is publishing a paper. It goes to a very niche audience, but it gets our point across. And that kind of three-part process of the research, the what we're bringing to it, and how we get the message out is very similar to the theatrical process. And stripping it down to those elements, I found quite a helpful way of just, you know, getting rid of all the technicalities, getting rid of, you know, all the detail of what we're looking at scientifically and just looking at that process. Do we know if we're ready to go?
Let's give it a go, shall we?
Cool, just because this is the best natural stop.
Yeah, go for it.
Hello?
Hello?
Do you think we've got to use the microphone?
Yeah.
There's number 3 on it. Does that mean we can do 1 and 2? Hello? Right. Hello?
If you speak to the mic.
Hello? Hello?
How are you feeling?
Confused, mainly.
How does this make you feel? Name 3 things that make you happy.
Friends, food, and holidays.
When was the last time you had sex?
Okay. Number 1 actually say. No.
Oh, there's another.
Oh, is that
I mean, it looks pretty dark.
from the light?
Yeah.
Hello. Hello. How are you doing? Yeah, okay. You?
And what do you do at university?
It's a bit hard to explain. Just sort of sort stuff out. Yeah.
So all them kids misbehaving.
Sometimes Jack and them are.
Yeah, I've got to do more teaching, and sometimes you have to keep them in line a bit, but...
Who's Jack?
Paul. It's me, she was talking
Sorry.
about me.
Paul!
Yeah.
Paul. So Paul works for you.
Yeah.
So here's like a whole shit. I don't know if they're power, or if they just need plugging in at random, or what.
Well, is this real milk? I'm starting to like doubt it. Like, is this milk? What if it's not
What's
milk?
going on? Okay.
Okay.
I'm liking this travel kind of documentary music.
Yeah. 7.
Oh.
Wow.
Oh, that looks fun. What?
We've got to do something with this.
1993, what does the pen say on it? Nothing.
But
There's a
the
knife.
balloons have it says 99 red
No,
balloons.
It's got 1999. Ugh, 1999. I really want to jump on it, but I'll smack my face on it.
Disaster.
Disappointment is an underinflated balloon.
Green is not a colour.
Dettol and wire wool.
All you need.
Oh no, there's another floor.
God, this is way bigger than I thought it was.
Oh. Did you just see a shadow move down there?
Let's go. Yep, yeah, I did. Guess how long have we been going around here?
I don't know.
50 minutes. Yeah. I feel like we've got to know each other in the last hour or so. So
Yeah, it's been a surreal team building exercise.
yeah. I'm really, really glad I didn't choose to go separate ways on this one. Because I think that would be
yeah.
quite odd and intense.
I mean, at the...
Was this here already?
No, these weren't here. This is getting
Poor
a bit-
me! Okay.
How much?
Until you deem it full, I'm thinking about
I mean, like, how many cups? This isn't a protocol.
Let's see how many you can fill. That's crazy.
Oh, damn, I spilled some. Oh,
Oh,
no,
no.
it's split. Oh, on purpose? Malicious cup splitting back.
So yeah, hopefully, as you can see, it was quite a different Tuesday afternoon for me as a scientist. So yeah, going back to what I said about putting you in that mindset and how that's helped my outreach. Since I went to the Playhouse, we've had some discussions and started to look at what we can generate as output. And again, much like with dementia, it's very easy to kind of display the problems. Working on antibiotic resistance and the research that myself and the group around me are doing, there's a lot of advice out there that's kind of very kind of authoritative. This is the message, just trust us. And rather than just that kind of external thing, we were looking at the relationship between patients and doctors and researchers, and really what people might feel. And there's quite a gulf between what the message is and what we imagine people might feel. So this came up with the concept of starting to develop a blog. So we're looking at kind of the questions that patients might have as to why antibiotic resistance is an issue. why doctors don't give antibiotics, and some of the kind of secondary line of questioning, rather than just the kind of government-approved messages of don't take antibiotics, trust your doctor, and the very kind of blanket responses that are generally out there. And really, it's to try and start a dialogue. So this is the starting point, and it was just recorded yesterday, so we'll see how it is with my face being about 3 foot across on a massive screen. But yeah, so we've intended this as a starting point, and this is kind of what we've achieved. But if you've got any questions at the end, feel free to ask us. Thank you. Today's question we're looking at is why sometimes when you go to the doctor, do they not give you antibiotics? So hi, welcome to the channel. We are researchers at the University of Leeds, and we're working on some of the problems surrounding antimicrobial resistance. And there's a lot of issues that have been discussed about drug-resistant infections and why this is becoming a problem. So we're putting these videos together to hopefully help explain and answer some of your questions about it. So today we're looking at the reasons why when you go to the doctor sometimes they won't give you antibiotics. Quite often, especially around winter, New Year, if you go to the doctors with a cold or the flu, they don't want to send you away with antibiotics. And this is because the doctor will have diagnosed that you've got a viral infection. Antibiotics are a really fascinating group of drugs, and they have been developed specifically to fight bacteria. A lot of illnesses, bronchitis, tonsillitis, generally anything that ends in the word itis, they're illnesses caused by a bacteria. And the antibiotics are used against those illnesses in order to specifically fight the bacterial infection, but leave the cells within your body alone. Which means if you've got a viral infection like the flu or a cold, the drug doesn't have that part of the bacteria to work on. One of the other big problems, if you do take antibiotics when you shouldn't, is that from a lot of advertising, a lot of media, this concept of friendly bacteria, we have in our bodies, almost 10 times the number of cells of friendly bacteria than we do human cells. So if you take antibiotics, it can be really damaging for them, and they help with all sorts of jobs of actually fighting off infections themselves, digestion. They have a lot of jobs that they help us with. So if you take antibiotics when you don't need them, that can have quite big complications. One of the other problems about taking antibiotics when we don't need them to is how it can increase the problem of antibiotic resistance. So the first antibiotics were released just under 100 years ago, so in the 1920s and 1930s. And as they were effective and started killing off bacteria, they were leaving some of the bacteria unharmed. And much like evolution in every other living organism, once you kill off some of a species and leave some of them unharmed, those ones can then grow stronger and grow faster because they're not competing as much. So what we've done by using antibiotics for the last 80 years, is we've enabled the evolution of stronger strains. And because bacteria can reproduce about every half an hour, that 80 years is the equivalent of tens of millions of years of human evolution. So we've really encouraged the emergence of these resistant species. So a lot of the work we're looking at is on reducing the amount of antibiotics that are prescribed, so it doesn't encourage those more resistant strains of bacteria to grow, and that's some of the work we're doing. So that's really the reason why doctors try not to give you antibiotics when they think you don't need them. That's what we're looking at today. Feel free to subscribe if this is what you're interested in. We'll be talking more broadly about the research we're doing and how this fits into the bigger picture. If you've got any questions about this or about the work we're doing, we have a website with a link below. Feel free to subscribe to the channel, and if you've got any questions, comments or ideas, please include them.